Hi everyone, now you're watching my channel. All the content I create myself, new videos every day, so don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot. Thanks, bye!
Homeless black veteran inherited an abandoned farm for $5. What was hidden in the walls made him rich. The auctioneer's gavel struck a stained Formica counter 3 times, and no one in the room paid any attention. No one except Samuel Ross. He was standing at the back of the hall, wearing an olive green military jacket that had fit him better 20 years ago, holding a handwritten number on a sheet of paper folded in half. The number was 53. The bid was $5. The ranch had 122 acres in southwest Texas, and everyone who had looked at the county records in the last 3 years knew the place wasn't worth the paper the deed was written on. The roof was sagging in 2 places. The well was clogged. 60 years of accumulated tax debt on land that produced basalt and dust. The only reason the county still put that property up for auction year after year was pure bureaucracy. No one bid. The debt grew. The cycle began anew. This time was no different. There were 16 people in the hall. 11 were county employees. 4 were licensed brokers, including Frank Morris, who stood in the hallway drinking coffee and looking at his phone throughout the entire session. The auctioneer read the address. He asked for bids. Samuel held up the folded sheet. $5. Frank Morris looked up from his phone. He stared at Samuel for a full second. Then he looked back down at the screen and said nothing. Hammer. 3 strikes. Sold. Outside, the November sun beat down heavily on the gravel parking lot. Samuel stood still for a moment with the provisional deed in his hand, a 2-page document bearing the clerk's signature and a faded purple stamp. He folded the paper carefully, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and took a deep breath, not of relief, not of joy, of something that had no easy name, of weight, perhaps. For 3 years he had been sleeping in shelters. For 2 years he had been sleeping in the back seat of a 1998 Ford Ranger that had broken down on a service road outside San Antonio and never started again. For the past 8 months, he'd been sleeping in a makeshift tent under a bridge on the banks of the Rio Grande with 4 other men whose names no one asked. Samuel was 58 years old. He'd served in the U.S. Army for 22 years. He'd set foot in 3 countries he'd preferred to forget, and he'd arrived at that gravel parking lot with exactly $8 in his pocket. 5 went toward the farm. He used the other 3 to buy enough gas to get there. The property was 42 kilometers from the county seat at the end of a dirt road that ended at a rusty gate without a lock. Samuel got out of the car, a Chevrolet borrowed from a shelter volunteer who hadn't asked any questions, and stared at it for a long time before opening the gate. The main house was a block of red brick with paint peeling down to the rotten wood. The roof had caved in on the right side, leaving a triangular opening through which the November sky appeared clear and indifferent. The front porch was missing 3 boards. The windows were all covered with plywood nailed from the outside, except for one, which had been covered with plastic bags held in place by yellowed tape. Samuel walked slowly toward the front door. He pushed it. It opened without resistance. The smell was of damp wood, of ancient earth, of something that had been shut away for far too long. Light streamed through the cracks in the plywood in oblique streaks that illuminated the dust suspended in the air. Samuel stood in the doorway, looking into that room with its 40-odd square meters of abandonment. There was a chair, just one, in the center of the room, its upholstery gnawed by rodents. There was a calendar nailed to the wall, open to the month of March 1987. There was a lighter, rectangular mark on the wall where a picture had likely hung, and just below that mark, a vertical crack in the plaster that ran from the floor almost to the ceiling. Long, irregular, as if the wall itself had once decided to split in 2 and then changed its mind halfway through. Samuel stepped inside. He had no plan. He had no tools. He had no money for renovations. He had technically nothing but a provisional deed with a faded purple stamp and the silent understanding that this place could become something, or could simply be the latest mistake on a long list. But it was his. For the first time in 3 years, there was an address with his name on it. He crossed the room and went to the window covered in plastic bags. He tore off the tape with his hand. The bag fell. Light poured in all at once, dusty but real. Outside, the land stretched as far as the eye could see, dry, barren, covered in straw-colored undergrowth, of no apparent value, with nothing that promised anything. But there was something about that crack in the wall. Samuel turned his face toward it without knowing why. He just looked, and it was at that moment that he realized the crack wasn't just a crack. It was an opening. Someone, at some very ancient time, had filled that gap with plaster, and time had revealed what the plaster had tried to hide. There was something inside the wall. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's much more to come. Samuel didn't have a hammer. He had his hands. He used both of them. The plaster crumbled in irregular pieces, falling onto the rotten wooden floor in clouds of white dust. He worked in silence, kneeling, prying the material away with his fingers until the opening was wide enough for him to slip his arm through. The wall was double-layered, brick on the outside, wood on the inside, and in the space between the two layers was a bundle wrapped in dark oilcloth, tied with string that came undone at the first touch. Samuel opened the bundle on the floor. Inside were 3 items. The first was a small notebook with a black cover, its edges corroded by moisture but the pages still legible. Handwritten in archaic English, in small, right-leaning script. The second was a stack of folded documents, held together by a rusty metal paperclip. Samuel separated them carefully. They were deeds, contracts, receipts dated from 1918 to 1924. Many bore the Presidio County stamp, and on nearly all of them, the same last name appeared in the owner's field. Ross. The third item was a medal, not a military one, circular, made of darkened bronze with a simple relief, a hand holding a tool that Samuel couldn't immediately identify. On the reverse, engraved shallowly but legibly, Elijah Ross, Presidio County, 1923. Samuel stared at that medal for a long time. Elijah Ross. He had never heard that name. He had no family to talk to about names. He had been raised by the state, passed through 7 foster homes before he turned 18, and joined the Army the day after his birthday, like someone entering through the only open door in a dark hallway. The surname, Ross, was all that remained of a story that had never been told to him. He clenched the medal in his closed fist until he felt the cold metal against his palm, and then, for the first time in more years than he could count, Samuel Ross cried. It wasn't the cry of someone giving in. It was the short, dry sob of someone recognizing something that had been lost. 3 breaths, 4. Then it was over, and he wiped his face with the back of his plaster-stained hand. He returned to the documents. The stack was thick, and the more he leafed through it, the clearer it became that those pages told a story of land, of ownership, of transfer, of recorded sales and purchases. The oldest documents dated back to 1918, when someone named Elijah Ross had originally purchased that property. There were payment receipts, letters from the county bank, a hand-drawn map with the property boundaries marked in pencil. The land was the same. The boundaries matched what Samuel had on the deed in his coat pocket. But there was something wrong with the final documents. The last contract in the stack, dated March 1924, had an entire line crossed out in thick red ink. Not crossed out, not corrected, but erased with the deliberate intent of making it illegible. Samuel tried to read along the edges of the erasure. He couldn't. Whatever had been written there, someone had decided it should never be read again. He carefully folded everything back up and put it away in the waxed paper wrapper. That afternoon, Frank Morris showed up. Samuel heard the car before he saw it. A new black pickup truck coming down the dirt road at a calculated slowness. Frank got out without haste, wearing a smile that looked as though he'd practiced it in the mirror that morning, and walked up to the porch with his hands in his pants pockets. "I just came to see how the new owner was settling in," Frank said, looking at the front of the house with an expression that tried to seem friendly but didn't quite succeed. "I'm fine," Samuel said. Frank nodded. He stood still for a moment, and then his eyes drifted downward. Not to the walls, not to the sagging roof, not to the boarded-up windows, to the floor, to the yard, to the ground beneath his feet. A quick, almost imperceptible glance. But Samuel saw it. "If you need anything, let me know," Frank said, and walked back to the pickup without waiting for a reply. Samuel stood on the porch watching the truck disappear into the dust on the road. There was something about that glance at the ground that didn't fit with the casual visit of a friendly real estate agent. It was the look of someone checking for something they already knew was there. In the days that followed, Samuel began cleaning the inside of the house, using tools he found in a shipment donated by a small Baptist church in Marfa: a hammer, a shovel, a hoe, rubber gloves. He worked alone from dawn until dark, and as he opened up the walls to check the structure, he found more. Not packages, not documents, coins. The first pouch was behind the wall of the back bedroom, a worn leather pouch containing 43 American gold coins, all dating from before 1924, some with circulation marks, others nearly intact. Samuel laid them out in a row on the wooden floor and stared at them as if trying to understand a language no one else spoke. The second pouch was under the kitchen floor, inside a cold welded tin box. 27 additional coins, and along with the coins, a thick paper envelope containing a single one-page document, different from the others, without a notary stamp, written in a different handwriting than the notebook, with a line at the top that read, "Mineral rights, Ross property, Presidio County, Texas." Samuel read that line 3 times. Then he took the envelope, put it with the waxed paper package, and went straight to find a lawyer. Diana Patel's office was in a 2-story house on Marfa's main street, with a discreet brass plaque next to the door and 2 potted plants that hadn't been watered in at least a week. Samuel climbed the stairs with the waxed paper bundle under his arm and knocked on the frosted glass door before entering. The receptionist looked up. She was young, blonde, with a name tag that read Lily. Samuel said he didn't have an appointment but needed a rural property lawyer. Lily went into the inner office, came back, and said Dr. Patel had 15 minutes between appointments. Diana Patel was shorter than Samuel had expected, stocky, in a navy blue suit, her dark hair tied back carelessly. She shook his hand without smiling and gestured to the chair across the table with a movement that clearly signaled the 15 minutes had begun. Samuel opened the bundle on her desk. Diana didn't touch the documents right away. She looked first at Samuel, at his military jacket, at his calloused hands, at the way he placed each sheet of paper on the table with the care of someone handling something fragile. Then she opened the first document with both hands and began to read. The 15 minutes turned into 40. "Where did this come from?" she asked without taking her eyes off the paper. "From the wall of the farm." Diana looked up. "From the wall?" "Yes." She returned to the documents. There was a subtle shift in her posture, a different, more intense focus that Samuel recognized as the moment when someone stops asking polite questions and starts asking real ones. It was at that moment that Lily opened the half-open door to bring in a coffee no one had ordered and saw the name at the top of the first document, Elijah Ross. Lily stood there for 2 seconds with the tray in her hand, looked at Samuel, looked back at the paper, and then left without leaving the coffee, without saying a word, closing the door with such excessive care that it was louder than if she'd slammed it. Diana didn't notice. Samuel did. "I'm going to need some time to go over this properly," Diana said. "Some of these documents have implications I need to check in the county records." "How long?" 3, 4 days. Samuel left the bundle on her desk and walked out. He returned to the property. He continued cleaning. And it was on the morning of the 3rd day, while he was removing the rotted wood paneling from one of the back rooms, that Frank Morris appeared for the 2nd time, this time without his practiced smile. "I need to make you an offer," Frank said, standing in the doorway without asking permission to enter. "Go ahead." $50,000 for the property. Cash. Deed transferred this week. Samuel stopped what he was doing. He stared at Frank for a moment, long enough to make the other man slightly uncomfortable. "Why?" "Because this property needs renovations that will cost more than $50,000. You're throwing away money you don't have." Frank said this in the voice of someone being reasonable, of someone doing a favor. "How much did you bid on that lot at the auction?" Frank blinked. I didn't go to the auction. I saw you there. 2 seconds of silence. I was just passing by. You were in the hallway with coffee in your hand, staring at your phone for 40 minutes. Frank didn't answer right away. He visibly reorganized his argument internally. The fact is that property isn't worth renovating for you. 50,000 will solve your situation. I'm not interested in selling. Frank stood there for another moment. Then he left. Samuel returned to the wooden ceiling, but that night he couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling of the room where he'd set up a foam mattress bought at the second-hand store in Marfa, thinking about Frank's gaze fixed on the ground on the first day, about how he'd looked at the land, not the house, about the $50,000 offered for a piece of land that was supposedly worth nothing. A licensed realtor who had been at an auction but hadn't placed a bid. Samuel opened his cell phone, the same old model he'd been using for 2 years with a cracked screen in the corner, and looked up Presidio County's tax auction bidding rules for licensed realtors. He found the answer in 8 minutes. A 1987 county resolution, obscure, rarely enforced, prevented real estate brokers registered in the county from purchasing properties at tax auctions without prior approval from a committee that met every 6 months. Frank Morris hadn't bid not because he didn't want to. He had been prevented by the bureaucracy of the very place where he himself worked. The farm Samuel bought for $5 was the farm Frank Morris had planned to buy, and Frank knew there was something beneath that ground. Diana called on the morning of the 4th day. She didn't text, she called. When Samuel answered, she said only, "I need you to come now." He arrived at the office 40 minutes later. Diana was standing behind the desk, not sitting, with the documents from the package spread out over the entire surface, each with a yellow post-it note marking a specific point. There were also 2 new folders beside them, records she'd pulled from the county archives, Samuel assumed. Her eyes had the dry gleam of someone who hadn't slept much. "Sit down," she said. Samuel sat down. "I'm going to tell you what I found, and I need you to listen to everything before you ask any questions." He nodded. Diana began with the oldest documents. Elijah Ross had purchased that property in 1918 with money from a farm labor contract, saved over 8 years, under conditions Diana described only as difficult, and which Samuel understood without needing details. In 1919, Elijah had built the house. In 1921, he had expanded the property by purchasing an adjacent lot. In 1922, Presidio County had installed the first rural electrification poles in the region, and Elijah's farm was on the route. In 1923, a geological survey team hired by a Dallas company had passed through the property and taken measurements. The results had identified, beneath that dry and seemingly unproductive land, a medium-sized natural gas formation. Not huge, but enough. In March 1924, Elijah Ross had signed a document. Diana paused. She placed her hand on the last contract in the stack, the one with red ink crossed out. "This one," she said. "What was written under the erasure?" "I took it to a forensic document analysis firm in El Paso." Diana opened the new folder. "It's a buyback clause. Elijah signed a contract to sell the property, but with a clause giving him and his heirs the right to repurchase it for a fixed price at any time over the next 100 years. And the mineral rights to the subsoil were explicitly excluded from the sale. They remained with the Ross family regardless of any future transfer of the land." Samuel fell silent. "Someone crossed out that clause after the contract was signed," Diana said, "and all subsequent property transfer records treated the sale as complete and unconditional. The clause disappeared from the county records. The only existing copy was on the wall of your ranch." Samuel looked at the scattered documents. "What does that mean?" "It means the mineral rights to this property were never legally transferred to anyone. They've remained with Elijah Ross's heirs for a century." Diana took a breath. "I researched the documented reserves in this formation. The county's latest assessment, from 2019, puts the extraction value at approximately $4.2 million, and that's using the most conservative market estimates. $4.2 million. Samuel said nothing. He stared at the bronze medal he had placed on the table at the start of the conversation, the medal with the name Elijah Ross, 1923, engraved on the back. The hand in relief that he hadn't recognized was the hand of a worker holding a hoe. "There's more," Diana said. She opened the second folder. Inside was a printed family tree, compiled from county records, bank records, and 2 local church archives. Elijah Ross had 2 sons. The eldest died without issue. The younger one, Joseph Ross, left Texas in 1931 and went to Louisiana. Joseph had 3 sons. One of them enlisted in the military in 1961. Diana placed her finger on a name in the tree, Arthur Ross. Arthur Ross had 1 son, an only child, born in 1967 in San Antonio, Texas, registered as Samuel Arthur Ross. The silence that followed was not one of astonishment. It was something deeper and harder to name. The silence of a piece that fits into a place that had been empty for so long you had stopped missing it. Samuel looked at the family tree, at his own name at the end of a line that began in 1918 with a man who had bought land with 8 years' worth of savings and built a house with his own 2 hands. He hadn't bought the farm for $5. He had returned to it. Frank Morris received the legal notice on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a county clerk's officer at his office door. Samuel knew about it because Diana called to warn him before Frank had time to call her. The notice was a formal request for recognition of hereditary mineral rights to the property from Presidio County, based on Elijah Ross's original documents, the forensic analysis of the crossed-out clause, and the genealogical chain linking Samuel directly to the original owner. Along with the request, Diana had attached a petition for a criminal investigation into the tampering of county records. The erasure in the resale clause was not an administrative error. It was a crime that had gone unpunished for a century. Frank called Diana 30 minutes later. Samuel was sitting in the chair across from her, listening to the part of the conversation he could hear. "You're making a serious mistake," Frank said, loud enough to carry through the phone. "This man bought a piece of land for $5 at a tax auction. There's no inheritance, no clause, nothing but a rotten piece of paper found in a wall." Diana replied in a completely flat voice. "The forensic report on the document is from a company certified by the state of Texas. The chain of title has been verified by 2 independent notaries, and the copy of the deed in the county records has been replaced. The original document shows physical erasures inconsistent with natural wear and tear. That's evidence of tampering with a public record, Frank, and it's already in the hands of the county prosecutor." Silence on the other end. "What does he want?" Frank asked after a moment. Diana looked at Samuel. Samuel nodded once, slowly. Full and unrestricted recognition of mineral rights. Nothing more, nothing less. Frank hung up without answering. In the days that followed, Samuel continued working on the farm. Not because he needed to. Diana had said the case could be resolved in a matter of weeks, given the documents, but because there was something in that house he needed to finish. There were 2 walls left in the back room that he hadn't checked yet. One of them was covered with old wallpaper, striped in green and white, peeling off in strips at the edges. Samuel slowly peeled away the strips. Beneath the wallpaper was a painting, not a framed canvas, a painting directly on the plaster, done with earth-based paint, with the austere precision of someone who had no access to better materials, but possessed steady hands. It was a landscape. The farmland, recognizable by the horizon lines and the rock formations to the northeast, and in the center of the landscape, small but clear, a human figure standing, looking out over the land with hands open at their sides. No caption, no date. But Samuel knew. It was Elijah. He stared at that painting long enough for the sun to shift position, and then he went to the corner of the room, sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and simply stayed there. He didn't pray. He didn't say a word. He just stayed. 3 weeks later, the county prosecutor opened a formal investigation into the tampering of the Ross property's land records. The documents indicated the involvement of at least 2 local families with political power in the region, a chain of active negligence and cover-ups that had begun in 1924 and had been maintained out of self-interest for decades. Frank Morris wasn't the source of the problem, but he had known and he had acted on it. The gas extraction company that had conducted the assessments in 2019 contacted Diana the following week. They wanted to negotiate the extraction rights directly with Samuel. Diana presented the proposal one December afternoon, with the winter sun streaming through the office window and the oilcloth bundle on the table between them, returned to Samuel after the experts had finished their analysis. The initial offer was $3,200,000 for the extraction rights, with an 18% royalty on production for the next 30 years. Samuel looked at the number. He looked at Diana. "What do you think?" "I think they know the land is worth more than they're offering." "Then negotiate." They negotiated. On the morning Samuel signed the final contract, $4,700,000 plus royalties, in a company meeting room in Midland with Diana by his side and a company lawyer across the table, Frank Morris was sitting in a chair in the county courthouse hallway, waiting to be heard by the prosecutor regarding the notice of investigation. Samuel walked down the hallway on his way out. Frank looked up. The two stared at each other for a second. Samuel said nothing. He didn't slow his pace. He didn't look away. He walked straight past, wearing the olive green coat that had fit him better 20 years ago, with the farm deed in one inside pocket and Elijah Ross's bronze medal in the other. Outside, the sun beat down on the street. Samuel stopped on the sidewalk, closed his eyes for a moment, and felt the heat on his face. Then he opened them, looked toward the horizon, and kept walking. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell stories that deserve to be heard.